Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. We are back again, Justin Higgins and myself. I'm fresh back from a trip to the United Kingdom around the time of Independence Day weekend. Of course, I flew back to the United States on Independence Day because, as an American, you can't be there on the 4th of July. It's absolute sacrilege. But I'm back here in the United States, and we're here to talk about politics and about media. We're a little bit of both on this program. For politics, we've got some interesting things going on inside the Republican Party. Of course, an area of expertise for our co-host, Justin Higgins. There seem to be some schisms inside of the Freedom Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives. But we have some other media matters to discuss, in particular, the launch of a new text-based social media app, which seems to be a rival to Twitter. It's really mirrored Twitter almost identically in its format. And that's Threads, which comes not from some obscure startup like other previous competitors, but from the big major giant of social media, and that's Meta, formerly known as Facebook. So there's a lot to talk about. Justin, shall we start off by talking about everything that's happening in the GOP House?
It really is almost shameful, John, to have to admit that I have expertise in crazy. And that's really where we're going to begin. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene, the House Freedom Caucus. So for our listeners, you all know House Freedom Caucus is roughly 52 members, now 51. And they are the most, generally speaking, the most extreme members of the caucus. So they are your Trump supporters. They are your white supremacists like Paul Gosar. They are your folks that former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, termed legislative terrorists. These are the folks that were pushing for a debt default of the United States government, which could have created a global recession or, God forbid, depression if they had went through with it.
So, Justin, let's give the listeners a little bit of context here. You mentioned that the Freedom Caucus has 52 members. To figure out how important that is, we should look at the size of the GOP majority, right? Because the margin is very thin in the House of Representatives, and you really need almost every member on your side if you're going to pass something. So what's the actual margin? How many votes can the Republicans afford to lose? How many members do they need to carry on if they want to get something over the line?
Yeah, John. So as everybody knows, you need a simple majority, and there are 222 Republicans, 212 Democrats. So the Republicans can only lose, Speaker McCarthy can only lose 4 votes to pass legislation with a majority if all members of the House are there to vote. Listen to these type of members. You have Matt Gaetz is one of the 52. You have Paul Gosar, who was censured last Congress, the 117th Congress, for posting an anime, a really weird, bizarre anime video showing him violently striking AOC, an avatar of AOC, with a sword. Clay Higgins, who recently tweeted out during the Trump indictment some weird code telling supporters to look at the bridges and get ready for war. And then obviously the infamous Jim Jordan. These are the folks, John, that Kevin McCarthy's speakership really relies on. So it's not only a growing bloc, it's not only an influential bloc, but it's also a bloc of literally the most crazy members of the House of Representatives.
So in the House of Representatives, you need 218 votes to pass something. There's only 222 Republicans. So of the 222, 52 are people in this category. That means that McCarthy either needs Democratic votes or he needs to bring almost all of these people on board if he wants to get something across the line in the House. Out of 52, he has to have 48 of them. So these people matter. They have a big presence in the caucus.
They have a huge presence in the caucus. And my former boss was a member of the House Freedom Caucus. And the way they operate is they usually have weekly or bi-weekly meetings when the House is in session. It used to be at Tortilla Coast, which is now shut down, a restaurant a block or two away from the House office buildings here in Washington, D.C. But they do have these regular meetings, and in the meetings, they will discuss strategies for legislation. They will discuss strategies for politics, not only the policy strategy, media strategy, and then they'll vote on things. And I think we're starting out here because recently it became public knowledge that a couple weeks ago they took a vote and they actually expelled Marjorie Taylor Greene from the House Freedom Caucus. This is a big issue for a couple reasons that I think we should dissect. Number one, there's just a lot of misinformation. A lot of people are saying, oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene was too extreme for the House Freedom Caucus. How extreme must she be? That's not true. She wasn't extreme enough. That's why they kicked her out. The second thing that makes this very interesting is she is a fundraising and media powerhouse within the right wing of our political media ecosystem. And the House Freedom Caucus members, that's what they inhabit. They are the right wing of elected officials. And then number three, I think it portends or foreshadows a coming split within the House Freedom Caucus that could rear its head at any point. It could be because of the Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis long, bloody, drawn out primary, or it could be over something like the Farm Bill, which is must pass legislation, or a government spending budget, which is must pass legislation, and how different members want to approach it. So although Marjorie Taylor Greene got kicked out, it's a really big issue that deserves attention because it's one of the small cracks that's beginning to widen and grow in the Freedom Caucus.
So, Justin, you mentioned that Marjorie Taylor Greene is quite extreme, but that wasn't necessarily the specific grievance that got her on the wrong side of this Freedom Caucus, which is populated by many extreme members who have not been expelled. Can you tell us a little bit about what actually was the reason why the Freedom Caucus were upset with Marjorie Taylor Greene and wanted to expel her from their ranks?
Yeah, John, and you and I were discussing this yesterday, today as well, and it was a combination of things, right? You said all of the above, and I got to agree with you. It was largely, though, the way that she allied herself with Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And if you remember, right, Speaker Kevin McCarthy was doing everything he could, fighting tooth and nail to become the next Speaker of the House. And as part of that, he prostrated himself on the floor and basically gave up everything that was asked of him to folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene. So she won some pretty plum seats on House committees, for example, like the House Judiciary Committee. And as a result of getting that seat, not only did Kevin McCarthy win her vote for Speaker, which is one reason why the House Freedom Caucus got pissed off, he also won her vote for the budget deal, which we had previously mentioned. That's the second thing that pissed off the House Freedom Caucus, was that she voted to increase government spending. I think largely, though, the straw that broke the camel's back, and this was a quote from Andy Harris, he said the straw that broke the camel's back was the way that she talked about Lauren Boebert.
Two of the most controversial Republicans in Congress had a profane exchange on the House floor today. The feud was between Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. It was caught on camera. You can see them chatting there, and it led to a lot of questions. There was reporting that the word, and pardon my language here, or the phrase, little bitch, was thrown around.
But it wasn't just Lauren Boebert. That was just the most recent example. When McCarthy was trying to become Speaker, Marjorie Taylor Greene, in exchange for what she wanted from McCarthy, went out there and was like an offensive lineman in American football. She was blocking and tackling. She was going out there. She was a pit bull, to use another analogy, and she was directly attacking, vociferously, John, attacking members of the Freedom Caucus like Matt Gaetz, like Lauren Boebert, for not supporting Kevin McCarthy. So it was really the way that she was using her bully pulpit, her bullhorn, to really malign these members of the Freedom Caucus starting in January and ending in June, July, that ultimately kicked her out.
So from my perspective, it seems like this is kind of an unresolvable problem for McCarthy, or a strategy that doesn't really end up working, because presumably part of the reason why he courted, or if not the entire reason that he courted Marjorie Taylor Greene's support in the first place, was because he thought that it would give him credibility with the right wingers, especially the ones in the House Freedom Caucus. But in doing so, he's caused her to become something of a pariah inside of that sphere. the fact alone that he did win her over is enough reason for them to be upset with her. So by trying to solve a problem, he's just undermined the solution. And it really, I think, draws the question of whether Marjorie Taylor Greene really does bring any value to McCarthy. Because if Marjorie Taylor Greene's partnership with him doesn't help him improve his standing among the Freedom Caucus, if all it does is make the Freedom Caucus mad at her, what good is it really doing him to be aligned with her? Because her perception in the broader American public, in the news media, and so on, is so incredibly negative. I also imagine that his efforts to try to build up her reputation, praise her to the press all the time, I mean, I would think that that would cause some groans among the rest of the GOP conference, right? I mean, the people like Don Bacon, and even the ones that are closely aligned with the leadership strategy, the McHenrys and so on, who aren't necessarily moderates, but are kind of establishment figures, as they used to call them. I mean, they can't be very happy to see McCarthy use so much of his political capital to rehabilitate Marjorie Taylor Greene. So was there any sense behind all the effort that he put into that? Is she providing him any value?
John, great analysis here. And I don't want to bore people with math, but the House Republican caucus is really broken down into the 5 families. This is what they call themselves. I would never term it this way because that's really a mafia term.
They're comparing themselves to the villainous gang leaders in the Godfather series.
Yes, that's the moniker that they use, the sobriquet, the 5 families. So the Freedom Caucus, which is now allegedly up to 52 members, is one. The Republican Study Committee, which is your traditional conservatives that are, not as outspoken, not as much of a lightning rod, and sometimes they overlap, is your conservative group, and that's your largest family, so to speak, in the Republican Party. Your Republican Main Street Caucus, chaired by Dusty Johnson, is kind of a little bit more moderate. It's certainly more moderate than the Freedom Caucus. It's more moderate than the Republican Study Committee. Then you have, and it's also your second largest group. Then you have your Republican Governance Group and your Problem Solvers Caucus. Problem Solvers being the smallest of all, roughly 30 members, co-chaired by Brian Fitzpatrick. Those 30 members, John, in the Problem Solvers Caucus are the folks that are in swing states, swing districts, in some cases in swing states, that are most vulnerable. And they have to be rolling around in their grave every time they see Marjorie Taylor Greene and Kevin McCarthy together, like you're saying, because it puts them at risk. Because a Democrat can then run an advertisement showing Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, represents them in some way.
Is membership in one of these camps mutually exclusive with membership in any other? Is it a clear divide where you can only be in one of those factions, or is there also quite a bit of overlap?
They are not mutually exclusive. So, for example, a lot of House Freedom Caucus members tend to be members of the Republican Study Committee. Those are the 2 most conservative groups. And I really balk at saying the House Freedom Caucus is conservative. They are hardline extremists. The Republican Study Committee is more conservative. And then, for example, your Problem Solvers Caucus and Republican Governance Group, they tend to have a lot of overlap. So these groups do overlap.
So if I was looking at this, I might say, look, you're talking about how important the House Freedom Caucus are. They're 52 members out of 222. These other groups are bigger. They matter more. There's more people in the conference who are not Freedom Caucus members than there are who are Freedom Caucus members. But I suppose the problem is that when every single one of them matters, when your margin is only 4 votes, you can't upset any of them. You have to keep them all on side. So even small little corners, small little groups, interest groups that aren't even attached to these kinds of coalitions that we're describing, can topple you. Like, let's say that there's 4 members who have large soybean farms in their district. That's a group that could take down your speakership. Just there. You can't lose any constituency if you're trying to carry something with a margin that thin, right?
You're 100% right. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting, in that we mentioned legislative terrorists earlier, right? That's why it's so difficult to govern the House Freedom Caucus. You using soybeans as an example, right? For a problem solvers caucus, Republican governance, Republican Main Street, Republican Study Committee, even. These folks can be quote unquote bought off, bargained with policy, right? They all have objectives, whether it be larger ideological dreams to shape the direction of the country, or more specific to their district, like the soybean farmers. And there were examples during pieces of legislation that were contentious of McCarthy buying off Republicans with policy. The debt deal being one of them. One piece of policy that he used to win over votes from the other groups was permitting reform. However, with these House Freedom Caucus members, and this is kind of what gives them the power, is they don't really have policy priorities, right? Their priorities are media. And how do you get media? It's by sowing chaos and saying extreme shit. So typically speaking, they aren't team players like the other groups. They don't have clear policy priorities that are achievable. They're delusional in their asks. So McCarthy has to tiptoe. And you asked what the benefit of cozying up to Marjorie Taylor Greene was. And it's simple. He cannot afford to piss off the loudest, the most infamous member of the Freedom Caucus, because if he does, and she were to turn on him, that creates a permission structure for other House Freedom Caucus members who were potentially against her expulsion from the caucus, or who just absolutely hate Kevin McCarthy, to join her in a rebellion.
If the goal of any group inside the conference is just discord for its own sake and attacking and antagonizing leadership for its own sake, there's nothing you can really do to win over that group. If it's anything else, you can horse trade. It sometimes might be difficult if you've got groups with mutually exclusive goals, as we've sometimes seen, for example, with the state and local tax deductions. You can't have it both ways there, right? It's a hard trade-off. If people really want to eliminate those deductions, then you have others who they matter so much because of the districts they're in. You can't square that circle. It's difficult. But maybe you could find some other priority, some other interest to scratch or placate. But if the goal is just upsetting leadership and antagonizing leadership for its own sake, nothing you do it can ever satisfy that group. And this is kind of what I was saying before about Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, if part of what poisoned her in the eyes of the Freedom Caucus was that she had become an ally of McCarthy, I mean, it's just absolutely impossible to overcome, because you make an overture to this person, and just the fact that you've done that turns them into a pariah.
These House Freedom folks aren't team players, not only with what you said as differing goals to tear things down, but also, John, and I think all we need to do is look at Ron DeSantis, because he kind of epitomizes the House Freedom Caucus, right? These folks don't work well with others. They typically tend to be antisocial. And this is just not gratuitous shots at Ron DeSantis or the House Freedom Caucus. Just look at these members. It's Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert. It's Jim Jordan. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene. Ron DeSantis was one of these. It's folks that tend to be loners or hang out with one other person. So just not only their political strategy, not only the tactics they use, their demeanor, their character is mutually exclusive to teamwork, to building relationships with others. And that's kind of the situation that McCarthy is in. After the debt default deal, the House Freedom Caucus, these members that you're talking about, they held the House hostage. They started voting against the rules procedure. So the rules procedure is a vote that is taken before any piece of legislation receives a full vote on the floor. It determines the rules under which that legislation is considered. Usually, 99% of the time, Democrats, when they are in the opposition, will vote against a rule. Republicans will vote for a rule. It's extremely partisan. Even if you're going to vote against a bill, you vote for the rule so that it comes to the floor, and it's part of your normal procedure to respect the speaker and get the bill to the floor. When there was a vote on this gas stove legislation, messaging legislation, where Republicans were basically trying to pass legislation that would say you can't ban gas stoves because they think that that is something that is actively happening, and the Biden administration is trying to ban these gas stoves, so on and so forth. The House Freedom Caucus was so pissed off about the debt deal that they started to sink this piece of legislation through the rules. And they basically held the floor for a week.
Today we took down the rule because we're frustrated at the way this place is operating. We took a stand in January to end the era of the imperial speakership. We're concerned that the fundamental commitments that allowed Kevin McCarthy to assume the speakership have been violated as a consequence of the debt limit deal.
They refused to budge on this until they got concessions from Speaker McCarthy. Ultimately, they did. That concession was Anna Paulina Luna's measure to censure Adam Schiff. But I think that this really shows, John, the situation that McCarthy's in and how much these people hate him. Number one, they kicked Marjorie Taylor Greene out of the conference. Number two, they were willing to sink the rules package. So it belies a looming GOP civil war if McCarthy does want to pass legislation to keep the government open, if he does want to keep supplemental nutrition appropriations at its level of funding, which is going to be necessary to pass any piece of farm legislation. Those are food stamps, colloquially known as. He is going to need to work with these Democrats. And once he does that, dude, he's going to lose his speakership because the last thing before a motion to vacate is sinking rules. So he's in a really tenuous situation here.
Yeah, I suppose part of what you're describing, and this is something that we do often see in politics, not just in the House, not just in the US, but in any political system, is that sometimes a coalition is brought together or defined more by personality and attitude than it is by actual policy goals. And you can see how so many people in the Republican Party conference are very conservative. And there might not even really be too much of a distinction on policy between people in this camp, the Freedom Caucus camp, and others in the conference, people who are maybe in line with leadership, Republican Study Committee, all these other groups that you're describing. But it's about the attitude. It's about the style. It's about, prioritizing these media messaging bills and efforts like the effort to censure Adam Schiff. Those are the things that really make the Freedom Caucus distinct as a group and that make them probably manageable. And I think that, just coming around to what you were just saying there about McCarthy's tenuous position and how he might need to rely on Democrats, it puts the Democrats in an interesting position because, of course, the Republicans are getting much more attention because they're in the majority and because there's so much going on inside their camp. But they're only about half of the House. There's an entire another half of the House that are Democrats. And that makes up a lot of the numbers on voting, doesn't it? So the Democrats, if they're finding that an important initiative like funding the government, debt ceiling, and all of this stuff, it can't pass with Republican votes alone. They have some choices here, right? They can help McCarthy get some of these things passed, maybe for the good of the economy and the good of the country. But there's probably a temptation among many Democrats to draw the dysfunction in the Republican conference really to the forefront and show how incapable the Republican conference is of governing and let the voters see the consequences of that chaos, right? I think that the Democrats were chuckling all along as they saw McCarthy struggle to get the votes that he needed to become leader. And this is the position they're going to be in again and again, right? They're going to have these choices of how they handle these tenuous situations that McCarthy keeps on getting in. I'm sure that so many Democrats enjoy watching McCarthy fail as he tries to achieve things because there's quite a bit of personal dislike and disrespect towards McCarthy. But Justin, as we see McCarthy get in more and more and more difficult position in his standing with the Republican conference, I mean, how do you expect that the Democrats are going to approach this?
Speaker McCarthy said at one point before he was speaker that when he takes the gavel from Pelosi, he's going to do all he can to not hit her with it. And that comment alone for obvious reasons, pissed off a lot of Democrats. I think that him and Minority Leader Jeffries have a better relationship than Pelosi, because these two really hated each other, and she was right to hate him, especially after those comments. But having worked for a member who was in the minority, it's going to be very interesting. I think that what we can do, John, is we can take the battle for speaker and kind of play that out. That's largely what it's going to be like, for the most part, right? Leave the debt limit aside, because that was such a serious thing that Democrats really didn't want to mess around with that. They just wanted a deal. Moving forward, you're going to need to have a farm bill passed. There are political reasons that you need it. On the Republican side, you have a lot of vulnerable members that just the largest interests in their district, like my former boss, are agriculture companies and farmers and the farm workers, and they need this legislation for certainty in the sector. Democrats need a farm bill passed because of what we mentioned, food stamps, as an example. So that's one thing that we need to look forward to. The other thing, John, is a government shutdown. And I think what we're going to see in both of these instances is Democrats are going to work from a position of trying to make Republicans and McCarthy specifically feel maximum levels of pain. So government shutdown, I think, going out on a limb, is going to happen. How it resolves itself really will depend on the media coverage. If it's like 2013, 2014, when Ted Cruz was getting crushed and it was really, really a good thing for Democrats and the media and messaging, then Democrats will be fine with letting it draw out 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month longer. If it's more like the government shutdown over DACA when President Trump was in office and Senator Schumer had to fold like a cheap suit because the media was not taking the side of the Democrats, then it'll quickly resolve itself. So that is to say, John, I think it's all going to be hardcore politics here, and the politics are going to determine how Democrats act, but they will be in no rush to help McCarthy out, and they will be trying to make him feel pain.
Yeah, Justin, you're talking about the reasons why Democrats have no love for McCarthy, and you're talking about the comment that he made where he suggested he wanted to hit Nancy Pelosi on the head with a gavel. I mean, I can think of something else that's probably even more viscerally felt, which is that former President Donald Trump incited a mob to attack the Capitol violently and put many members' lives in danger and their staff's lives in danger. And McCarthy, after demonstrating that he had a clear understanding of what actually happened and who was responsible in public and private comments, went ahead and visited Donald Trump and put a lot of work into rehabilitating Donald Trump standing in the Republican Party when that was never necessary. I think that is probably at the very top of the list of the reasons why Democrats don't love or respect Kevin McCarthy, and as you suggested, are probably right to hold those views. But I will say that at the same time, as I understand this instinct to maximize the pain and draw the dysfunction of the Republican conference into relief for the public, I think that can be a bit risky, because often the public might assign blame differently than political actors expect. I mean, the Democrats might believe that the truth of the matter is very clear, who is responsible for chaos and dysfunction. But it's not always as clear as they might like for those who are not following these things in minute detail or with the same perspective. I think that sometimes the public react to things in an unpredictable way, and that if there is a government shutdown, especially when there's a Democratic president in the White House, they might be disappointed at how the public reacts to that and how the public assign blame.
I do agree, John, and this is where the two parties are different, right? The Democrats have been a more top-down operation where they've been more team first. The Republicans have no solution for the House Freedom Caucus. When we get in these situations of great calamity, of chaos, of attention, the Democrats are able to quickly pivot. If they think a government shutdown will ultimately help them, they see polling a few days in, a week or two in, that it's not, they can immediately come to the table, try and get a compromise, and move forward. Whereas the Republicans, let these things draw out, because again, while leadership of the Republican Party may notice this is hurting them, they don't have the ability to get their members in line. So you're right. It will depend on how the event actually plays out in real time. But in these situations, even if it is going against Democrats, typically speaking, they can quickly resolve it because they have a control of their members.
Yeah, there really is such a sharp distinction and difference between the level of control that leadership seems to have in the two parties. And that's especially felt in the House. But it's also felt sometimes at a larger level. I remember in the 2016 presidential primaries, when there really was the sense that the Democratic Party had managed to clear the field for the party's preferred nominee. And there was such pressure against other significant figures in the party from running, and how the voters really were pressured, I think, pretty intently to vote in a certain direction in those primaries, and how it was revealed later on that the DNC and leadership of the DNC were using sometimes extraordinary methods to facilitate that, feeding debate questions in advance to the candidate of their preference, who is Hillary Clinton.
Donna Brazile.
Yeah. Who, of course, went to work for Fox News shortly after that was exposed. Anyway, there is really such a big distinction between that level of control that the Democrats seem to have. And it's seen in that instance, but it's also very much seen in the House. I think that was part of why there was so much excitement in the media, in the Republican Party, about the group that was called the Squad, these new progressive members that were coming in. There was the idea, and just to be perfectly clear, that was Ocasio, that was Ayanna Pressley, that was Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush. There was a lot of excitement among Republicans and in the media that we might get a spicier Democratic caucus, that we might see more acrimony on the Democratic side, that we could have even a version of the Freedom Caucus where there was kind of this open disagreement and an argument and rivalry inside the Democratic camp. And that didn't really end up happening. We saw how all of those members lined up behind Hakeem Jeffries, just as they had lined up behind Nancy Pelosi many times before. On the Senate side, you see a bit more acrimony inside the Democratic camp, right? You see how there are two, in particular, senators, Sinema, who's now independent, and then Joe Manchin, who remains a Democrat, who sometimes argue publicly with the leadership. But on the House side, you really see so little of that. And, we're talking about whether the public would have a clear idea of how to assign blame. I don't know how many people in the public do notice this, but for anyone who's following politics, it's really hard to ignore.
Yeah, and John, you're bringing me back to my days when I was a Republican. I would have bet you any amount of money. Oh my God, AOC, there's going to be this faction of the left, and it's going to be a Tea Party, and it's going to grow into 20, 30, 40 members, and they're not going to be governable. I would have been wrong. The whole Republican Party was certain that this was going to happen, and it didn't. And I think, analyzing this, what's different, these people on the left have policy priorities, John. We may not view them, I'm going to speak for myself, I may not view them as pragmatic all the time, but for example, Cori Bush had a big fight with Speaker Pelosi over the eviction moratorium during the pandemic. As a result, what did Cori Bush do? She ultimately did some protest where she was sleeping on the steps of the Capitol, and it got media attention. What did Nancy Pelosi sat down with her? They discussed possible legislative outcomes. They came to an understanding that Speaker Pelosi would try and get the president, Biden, to issue an executive order, and they moved forward. Cori Bush was placated. Biden, I believe, if memory serves, made the executive order, was struck down by the courts. That is pragmatism at work. And that's why this never happened, because these folks are fighting, generally speaking, for concrete policy perspectives. You can look at the Inflation Reduction Act. You can look at the transportation bill, right? Even the CHIPS Act. These hardline progressive members had policy goals that were put into these pieces of legislation, and many progressives would argue they made the bills better. So when you have team players, and these folks are ultimately team players on the left, and it's wild that I'm saying that. If you told me 6 years ago, John, 5 years ago, 2 years ago that I'd be saying this, I would have looked at you like you had 7 eyes.
Yeah, I remember when Pelosi was still Speaker, Ocasio not only seemed upset or unhappy with Jeffries, seemed to have disagreements with Jeffries. She was talking about encouraging a primary against Jeffries. So it really was surprising that she came around to support his leadership bid. And, there's a bit of a balance here, right? Because we've talked a lot about all the problems that come from the acrimony that we're seeing on the other side of the aisle. But at the same time, you don't want a hive mind either. You want to have some open disagreement and diversity inside the camp. I mean, we've seen, for example, in the Republican Party before the Iraq War, how having not as much room for disagreement and debate and having kind of a unified position on the way forward has had negative consequences. But it's about that balance. And I think what you're describing, where sometimes disagreement inside the camp on policy issues can lead to some interesting outcomes. I mean, that is a little bit different from having disagreement just on the fact of the leadership and so on, right? And that's more what the focus is, maybe on the Republican side. And the Freedom Caucus members are just more interested in the personalities at the top and who's winning that kind of personal conflict for prestige than they are about those policy outcomes. We're talking about disagreements on who's going to lead the Republican Party, and the Republican Party are undergoing the preview to what could be a pretty bruising primary that will really start up properly later on this year. The Freedom Caucus, how do these members feel about the upcoming primary? I mean, is there a clear favorite candidate between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis among these members, the members that we've been discussing?
There is, John, and this is where things get very interesting, right? McCarthy owes his speakership to Trump. Trump could have killed it in its infancy, as could have Marjorie Taylor Greene, from my perspective. But yes, Trump is the preferred candidate of the Freedom Caucus. That should be of no surprise to you. I hope you're not surprised by that, right?
I mean, I might be. I could certainly imagine how at least a significant number of members of the Freedom Caucus might be tempted to support DeSantis, who's much more focused on some of the right-wing culture war grievances that do seem to animate so many people in the Freedom Caucus, right? And I think that his personality, we're talking about the personality characteristics that unite the Freedom Caucus. Those personality characteristics are more shared probably by DeSantis than by Trump. A bit of introverted nature and orientation, that seems to be something that is particularly recognized in DeSantis. DeSantis was also a member of the Freedom Caucus. That's not worth nothing. And I remember the last time we had a Republican presidential primary, which was in 2016, that most members of the Freedom Caucus did not support Donald Trump. Most of them supported other candidates. So yeah, it's absolutely not impossible for me to imagine that DeSantis would appeal at least to some of them.
There is Chip Roy and Bob Good, who have endorsed DeSantis. And I just did a quick look as we were discussing this on Freedom Caucus members that have endorsed Trump in 2024. I'm not going to read them all, but it's Andy Bigg, Lauren Boebert, Eli Crane, Byron Donalds, Matt Gaetz, Paul Gosar, Clay Higgins, Marjorie Taylor Greene, RIP. She's not in the Freedom Caucus anymore. She hasn't died yet. So, but Ronnie Jackson, Jim Jordan, Anna Paulina Luna. It's the overwhelming majority is for President Trump. But this is the interesting part here, John. McCarthy is viewed, generally speaking, by most members of the Republican conference as also being in favor of Trump, but he can't endorse Trump just yet. Remember those more moderate groups that we have been talking about, the Problem Solvers Caucus, for example, where you have a group filled with swing district members. If Trump is on the ballot in 2024 general election, McCarthy's, I would venture to say, 99% going to lose his speakership because he's going to lose the seats. So he can't come out and endorse Trump while the Freedom Caucus want him to, because it would piss off and probably alienate and cause more headaches in the future with the Problem Solvers Caucus. So that's kind of the dynamic that we have here, John.
I mean, the most appropriate thing in a contested primary would be for the Speaker of the House to remain uncommitted, right? That would be appropriate ordinarily. If, we're talking about how the Democrats put their fingers on the scale too much for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and how it's probably inappropriate for senior party leaders to have such a clear preference. But that's not ever going to be satisfactory to Donald Trump, right?
But why is that? So from my perspective, as long as the party leadership is supporting the candidate I like, I think it's appropriate that they come out and back that candidate. Like, for example, in 2016, thank God they backed Clinton and they didn't back Sanders. I think it was totally appropriate for the country and the party.
I guess it's an interesting question. I suppose it really depends on at what point in the process we're talking about for a public endorsement, right? I mean, what I think was inappropriate was kind of the internal pressures that we saw against people like then Vice President Biden from jumping in the race. I think that was very unhelpful for the Democrats in the long run.
I guess this is a more interesting question to me. Why? Right? So the primary process is a closed off process where there does not have to need to be any elections. It's determined by the party. The party can go and have a convention and just nominate somebody like that. So to rephrase my question, what role should the elected officials in, for example, a Democrat or Republican party play in a primary process? And if it's not a role at all, then why?
Well, I think what you're describing is a scenario that is often visually described with the image of the smoke-filled room, right?
Yes. Yeah. In Chicago, right? Was the last one?
It's something like that. So this was the way that presidential nominations used to be determined, right? The elders in the party would come together and select a candidate. And there wasn't public participation in the selection. Not really. Sometimes the primaries were held, but they were more like recommendations or advisories than they were determining who is going to be nominated, right? And I think that, the United States has an orientation towards democratic participation. We've often opened up the franchise. We had women's suffrage. We had the Voting Rights Act to make sure that there was not going to be the level of racial discrimination in voting access. And we've also expanded the number of things in which people can actively participate through direct voting, right? I mean, one example is how U.S. senators, were not directly elected by the public. They were appointed through state legislatures. But we decided to open that up to public voting. And it's been the same thing with the presidential primaries. We didn't used to have direct public participation in presidential primaries, and now we do. And I mean, do you value that? Do you think that that's appropriate as a general trend, or are you more of an elitist?
I think generally as a trend, yes. But I think it's largely circumstantial too. So if, for example, it's 2016 and it's Clinton versus RFK Jr., and RFK Jr. is polling at 60% and Clinton's polling at 30%, I think it's totally appropriate for the House Democratic leadership to do everything in their power to tip the scales away from somebody like RFK Jr., who is dangerous for the party. And to use a more realistic example, I think that the Republican Party would have been served very well to do everything in their power, including changing rules, to ensure that Donald Trump was not the nominee in 2016. And as a result, we would have definitely avoided a coup attempt in 2021. So I guess it's neither black nor white.
This goes to the conversation that we were having with Shadi Hamid, right, about democracy and the value of democracy, right? Because it depends on whether you're taking a position based on outcome or based on the principle, right? So we can observe how democratic participation in the primary process has led to outcomes that we don't like. The best example being the nomination of Trump. If it was an elite-driven process without as much public participation, Trump wouldn't have been nominated. I mean, we know that really for a fact.
No,
and that might be true.
That's a fact.
Yeah, it really is. The Republican Party did not want Trump to be nominated. They didn't expect him to be nominated. And if the leadership of the Republican Party at the time, Reince Priebus and Mitt Romney and Mitch McConnell and people who were in the senior positions of the party at the time, if they had been able to select whoever they wanted, they would not have selected Trump, right?
Dude, they tried to get him to pull out after the Hollywood Access tape came out.
If we look at the other side of the aisle, and this is kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how there's an interesting difference where there's too little control on the Republican side, too much control maybe on the Democratic side from elite figures in the party. We can look at how taking that elite driven approach probably backfired in the Democrats, right? Because by not allowing a contested field of candidates, or I mean, I shouldn't say allowing, because it's not like they made a rule that said Joe Biden couldn't run, but by so heavily discouraging a competitive field of candidates, they ended up nominating someone who was a much weaker candidate in the general election than they realized at the time, right? So you can see how that level of democratic participation, that level of democratic input in the selection of the nominee has led to positive or negative outcomes. I mean, you can see negative outcomes from both models. So then you have to kind of go to the principle, right? I mean, you can take that outcome-driven view and you can probably come to either conclusion based on the cases that you're selecting, right? So then it goes back to the principle. And, do we believe in democracy and democratic participation? I mean, I think that you probably want some kind of a balance, right? The tricky thing is where you want to find the balance. I mean, I can think of times where I think there's been too much democratic participation in the process. I look at some referenda, like in the UK, where they decided we're going to let the entire public come and vote on whether Scotland will be an independent country, whether the United Kingdom will leave the European Union. And I wonder, why did you trust the general public with this question? And why did you set the margin at only 50%? If 50% of the public want you to rip up the country and end the union of the country or destroy the nation's economy, we're just going to go ahead and do it. That doesn't seem wise. That's not how representative democracy is meant to work. You trust those kinds of questions to the elected leaders. So I can certainly look at times where I think that even from a process perspective, there's a little bit more direct public input than I think is wise. But I mean, these presidential primaries, it's not like a referenda, because what we're doing is nominating leaders, right? So it does seem to be a situation where there's still already filters and barriers between, the id and the fervor of the general public and what's going to end up happening as policy.
Yes. And I guess here, where I believe democratic participation is necessary is the general election. I think as a principle, we need to have as much democratic participation as possible in the primary process. But I also think we need a failsafe. If RFK Jr., God forbid, ever were to become the Democratic nominee, I would support some measures being taken to prevent that from happening. I don't want a hypothetical matchup of somebody like Steve Bannon on the right versus RFK Jr. on the left, because I think that puts the country at an existential crisis where direct representation could be at risk, because both of these people are loons. And I think that losing some democratic input, myself included, on the front end is better than losing our democracy on the back end. So I guess there's gray, right?
Well,
there's nuance.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's about trying to find that balance. And I think that the party infrastructure could prevent people like Bobby Kennedy Jr. or Donald Trump from being nominated through simpler methods with a lighter touch. What if you had a rule that said you can't run in the presidential primary unless you've held elected office? That seems to be pretty straightforward rule that would eliminate candidates who shouldn't seriously be in contention, but would still allow a very wide field of credible figures to step forward and participate. And I think that part of the reason that the Republicans did not take that approach in 2016 had to do with their concerns over the personal, biographic or demographic diversity of the field that they were expecting to get, right? Because at the time, the only woman who was interested in running for president had not held elected office, Carly Fiorina, and the only Black American who was interested in running in the primary also had not held elected office, Dr. Ben Carson. So how could you set a universal rule that would eliminate Trump and allow them to participate? There was different ideas about how they could do that. I mean, someone suggested a rule that said you have to have at least run for a major office, and that would allow Fiorina to participate because she had run for U.S. Senate in California. But I think this is the kind of thing that they were grappling with. But I mean, a rule like that, I think, would be a light touch. It wouldn't be the party saying we want you to nominate this specific person. It would just be a filter that seems very sensible and could be universally applied.
this is interesting, but now we're all the way down the rabbit hole. I think that it wouldn't be a lighter touch because so much of the Republican messaging for decades to fool your common person, to ensure that big corporations get tax cuts, has been pro-business person, anti-elite, anti-politician, anti-establishment messaging. So if they were to make some rule like that, it would be at the core against the ethos, not only of what these people claim to stand for, but how they message themselves to the public. So I think that you could see a new party evolve out of that, where you get, some weird machination of far left, and then most of your working class Republicans come together. So anyway, that is to say, I think it's interesting. I think that every situation is unique here. There is a delicate balance, but at the end of the day, Trump is going to be the nominee here. And that will, in my humble opinion, McCarthy will endorse him. And that will cause a lot of these problem solvers, members in swing state districts to lose their seat, and the Democrats will win the House.
The social media giant Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, has officially launched its new app, Threads. The app will be linked to Instagram and is widely seen as a potential rival to Twitter. Meta describes it as a text-based conversation app. Users will be able to post up to 500 characters of text and 5 minutes of video and pictures.
We should get into the Musk versus Zuck perspective because, again, I think that social media is still, at least with microblogging, a winner-take-all proposition. And I think that Musk ultimately has driven so many people off of Twitter because of his politics, because of the changes he's made to the application so that it doesn't actually work as planned, that ultimately Threads will be the winner in this battle. What is your take here?
I don't really know yet. I think it's really early. The signups that we've seen on the new Threads app are obviously very impressive, maybe even unprecedented. And certainly in this sector, in this text-based microblogging.
They're saying it's the most downloaded app of any app in a small period of time. I think it's within 48 hours, it's well over 70 million downloads, which is outstanding.
I think also the biggest difference between Threads and the other startup Twitter imitators that have tried to, get a piece of Twitter's market is that Threads is backed by this huge company, a company that's always been much bigger than Twitter itself ever was, right? And that's a big distinction from these other startups that we've seen, Truth Social and Parler and Getter and Mastodon and Blue Sky. All of these were sort of garage type projects, whereas this one, Threads, is backed by one of the world's biggest companies, a GAFAM company. That's Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. In Europe, they always talk about the big five, the behemoths, the oligarch.
The five
companies.
Families, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Twitter was never in that company. You look at its market cap or whatever, it was never anywhere in the same sphere. Whereas this app, Threads, is being backed by one of those. And that means that it's able to market, promote the app on the other apps in its family, the Facebook app, the Instagram app. And that obviously gives it a huge, huge leg up.
John, just to give you some perspective here to support what you're saying, I think Twitter is valued roughly now at $15 billion after Musk took a blowtorch to it.
Much less than he paid.
Much less than the $44 billion he paid before Threads launched. It was valued like a month ago, before all of these technological difficulties. But even let's say $44 billion, which Musk paid. Twitter's Meta or Facebook's value is somewhere around $750 billion. That is 750 billion, which is just, it's bigger than most small countries.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. It's absolutely massive. And, that's not to say that they're always going to win and always get everything right. We've seen initiatives that they've taken that have failed. The metaverse doesn't seem to be a big success. but
So
it
dumb.
means that they are coming from a perspective of immense strength, and that they are able to promote this app on other apps like Instagram. I've seen that so many of the signups so far have come from Instagram users. Some of them, I'm not sure if they were ever even Twitter users. And it does change the dynamics of the new app. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of the things that I see on the Instagram app now on the Threads app, and it's very different from what I would see on Twitter. On Twitter, my timeline is a lot about Arabic politics and a lot about the entertainment industry. And then I go on Instagram and now on Threads, and I just see so much about the European football transfer market. So there's a big difference in what you're seeing, and it's that bleed over that's coming from Instagram. So I wonder if that's going to change the dynamics and culture of the app in a major way. It'll be interesting to see.
And you're pointing. So what they did basically, they took the Instagram architecture of the app and just overlaid Threads onto it. So that's what we're seeing here. I guess I wonder. I mean, so my Twitter feed is really similar to my Threads feed in that it's all baseball and it's all politics with a touch of foreign affairs, because I follow you and I follow some of the people that you follow.
That is politics.
That's true. That is true. So I mean, dude, the reason why I use microblogging sites is to get a feel for what is going on, whether it be largely breaking news, largely breaking political news. But also I want to get an understanding of what my favorite columnists are saying, what the columnists that I absolutely detest are saying and their arguments. I like both of that. And then I want to see, some funny videos, some sports stuff. But really, I use these apps to get a pulse of what is going on and then try and influence it by interacting with these folks. And I do think that whether it be sports or entertainment or politics, Threads thrives and depends on news and then politics. So from my perspective, it's ultimately going to trend towards something very similar, if not the same thing as Twitter, especially as it evolves and they add more features. They said they're going to add a feature to follow just people to have a feed of just people that you follow. They said they're going to add a feature of chronological order so that you can see things just like Twitter and it'll be a breaking news thing. So I don't know if you have different perspective, but I do think this will kill Twitter.
Well, one thing that I always appreciated about Twitter, and I just kind of want to elaborate on this because you were talking about, why you value Twitter in the microblogging format, is because I think that it opened us up to a lot of experts and academics you don't hear about just from reading the news media. So if you're reading news articles on New York Times, or if you're watching television news, CNN, Fox, and so on, you might hear from a subject matter expert, but in a way that's kind of crafted to fit a very broad overview of the topic. They'll interview the expert and they'll get like the short quote that they need just to help explain the basics of a topic to a reader or listener. It's all built in a way that you can get a broad overview of a subject, because they assume that the readers, aren't familiar necessarily with a lot of the nuances of an issue. And then in the places where these academics are publishing, it might be a really long form academic article or piece of research. You don't usually get to hear from these people in a shorter context and in exactly the way that they want to communicate, because it's being crafted to fit a news article or so on. But on Twitter, I found that remarkably, you can hear from these experts and analysts all the time in a short form with the kind of subject matter expertise and nuance that you can never really get from the news media. And I think that that's really been fantastic. I can go on there and I can read from experts on Middle East politics, European politics, and I could never hear from these people at that level otherwise. So I think it's been really valuable that way. And I'm not sure if all of those sorts of people are going to go over to the new app. So we'll see, because I've been trying to find them where I could on the new app, and I haven't found that many of them. So we'll see how it gets adopted. And that brings us to this question of winner take all. Social media always did feel winner take all. It felt like Facebook beat MySpace and then was the behemoth. And then Instagram came up as a competitor, and Facebook just bought Instagram. So there's still only one company that was kind of controlling the whole sphere. I think that the emergence of TikTok has suggested that social media isn't just going to be winner take all, because TikTok is thriving at the same time as Facebook and Instagram are still very popular with other demos. Now we see Gen Z really embrace TikTok, but we see that people our generation, the millennials, Instagram is probably the favored one. And then for the older generation, Facebook's probably the favored one. So there's a few that are all kind of doing similar things and are existing side by side. On this Twitter versus Threads thing, it does seem like it has to be one or the other because they're so similar. They're almost exactly the same in the way that they work. But I wonder if there's different subject matter focus on both of them. If people on one of them are talking about one kind of thing and another they're talking about different kinds of things. I mean, there might be a long period where we're just checking both and just wasting even more time because they continue to exist side by side. And it might be a while before we're able to crown one the winner, if ever.
So I do think we're going to be able to crown one a winner. And here's my theory of the case. I'll get to politics being the last. I think Threads is going to be the winner. So for most celebrities, so I'm thinking pop stars, music stars, I'm thinking actors, actresses, even some directors, right? Their big accounts are Instagram. It's visual, it's video, maybe TikTok too, but specifically Instagram here in my argument. And all they have to do is just open a Threads thing, and then basically everybody that follows them on Instagram is going to follow them on Threads, and their Threads accounts will immediately eclipse their Twitter accounts, and it'll be a streamlined app where they can post, most of their stuff very, very easily. I think politics-wise, liberals hate Elon Musk, and that is largely his own making, right? He has said things to virtue signal to conservatives. Not only that, he has said things very hateful against a lot of different minority groups that liberals that are liberals, and it really pisses liberals off. So there was a mass exodus of liberals from Twitter. That exodus will continue, and all the columnists, I think, eventually, as Threads continues to grow, not only because of all the Twitter users going over there, but because of what you said, there's now a lot more new microbloggers are using a microblogging site for the first time because of their Instagram accounts. There's just more value for these folks. And once liberals get over there, conservatives will follow, because conservatives use social media to troll and to fight. And that is the draw for them for social media. Otherwise, something like Truth Social, a Trump app, would have taken off, or Getter, or whatever other example you want to use.
Yeah,
but
Parler,
Parler, right?
Yeah.
Those things all are niche and shitty, and they basically died because there's no liberals to troll and gang up on and make fun of. Another thing that conservatives love on social media is to be the victim. So they're going to obviously flock to Threads. And once that happens, you're basically going to have the U.S. markets of athletes, of celebrities, and of politicians and people focusing on those things all move over to Threads. And ultimately, we still are the dominant market. So people who are commenting on foreign affairs largely still want to be heard by the West. And if the United States and the most powerful buying market in the world is on one app, why wouldn't these folks follow? So my perspective is, we'll be able to watch everything on this app, and it'll be controlled by a person that is unequivocally worse than Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, who is, I want to be careful here, allegedly responsible for stoking a genocide in Myanmar, is allegedly responsible for throwing numerous elections to the algorithm on Facebook, the misinformation he allowed to stew, the way that he allowed Russia and other countries to just manipulate specific elections. And he's done nothing about it. He's shown no remorse. And I think that him having all of this power is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, I mean, you said a few things there that are quite shrewd, and then others that I was going to take issue with. But you addressed some of the things I was going to raise, actually. So, I just wanted to draw attention to one thing that you mentioned there, which was about how you could bring your Instagram followers over. And I think that that's pretty important because, part of why these other startups weren't that appealing is because people knew that they had to start from nothing and rebuild all of their followership. And that's why the incumbency advantage of Twitter still gave it an edge. But with this new competitor, you have that incumbency advantage. If you're able to bring over your large following, you don't have to start from zero. This is also kind of interesting, and this is maybe disagreeing a little bit with what you said, because you mentioned that Threads could maybe grow in the U.S. market, and it could use that as a base to expand internationally. I actually think that as a Facebook, Instagram integrated tool, maybe the real advantage for Threads early on is going to be its ability to have a big international presence, right? Because aren't Facebook and Instagram more popular than Twitter outside of the United States, and Twitter a little bit more U.S. focused in its orientation? I think that is the case.
That is true, and that is a good point.
I don't know if I have the numbers in front of me, but
no, it's accurate.
Yeah, my impression has always been that the Meta apps, the Facebook and Instagram, were more international oriented vis-a-vis Twitter. So it could, it really expand its numbers hugely outside of the States. And then, you mentioned that Elon Musk's unpopularity among many Americans was going to push all these users over to the new app. But, what I was going to say is kind of what you've just said there, which was that Mark Zuckerberg is also quite an unpopular person himself. And among the concerns that you mentioned, another concern that I know that many have is the data privacy issue. And this has been maybe the big lightning rod in Europe. A lot of the criticism of Mark Zuckerberg's apps, the Meta apps, has been the way that they treat data privacy. And this is something that's definitely going to be a big issue with a new app. So I think that might deter a lot of socially conscious types from swiftly adopting it or fully embracing it.